No, if you want some, I'll get him some, but
Okay.
I'm looking.
Okay.
Pretty right there.
We can stop tape anytime. How have you been enjoying your stay in Toronto?
Well, I've been surprised, I guess, by the many things that have happened in a few days, and very happily surprised. I've heard and seen some of the nice things about the town. The town, it's really a city.
Yeah.
As Ray Bradbury referred to it as the most perfect city in the Western continent, and I think his opinion serves my own very well.
I'm proud that you like it. You said you were originally an illustrator rather than a cartoonist.
I should have, if I said that, I should correct it. I hoped to become a real good American illustration when I was in my teens and early 20s. Was one of the great arts in America. We had Saturday Post and Collier's and a few large, very important magazines who featured excellent illustrators by some of the best artists in America. And in my youth, I hoped I would be one of those. And to become one, I had a rather painstaking education.
Yes.
I studied in Chicago at the Art Institute. I studied in New York, and then, after I had earned a little money for myself doing more or less popular art, I saved enough to go to Vienna for 3 years, so I was reasonably well educated as an artist. But during this transition, about the time that I returned to America, television, radio first, and several years later television changed the aspect of the American public toward the magazines, and several of the real great ones simply folded up, went out of business, and the illustration field deteriorated. Well, luckily I had gotten into animation when I was quite young, and it began to develop. So out of the collapse of the one thing I had hoped to do, there was a sort of a rebirth in the growth of something I found equally interesting, and that was the animated cartoon.
Was there any condescension amongst your peers making that change from illustration to animation, such as, you know, an actor going from stage to theater?
Well, I never felt any condescension. What is the word?
Well,
I
God.
I never felt personally as though I gave up anything, because I enjoyed animation almost from, say the second month of my experience as an animator. I enjoyed it enough so that I didn't mind staying with it. And of course, along with the ability to animate, I found a recurrence of interest in various jobs. I started in with one of the very early studios, the William Randolph Hearst animation studio. And at that time, about the only one that was really organized was the Mutt and Jeff studio. The Felix studio came along later, and the Bray studio, and then they multiplied. And while these studios were the Terry Tunes, I think it is originally Terry and Bray, they separated and formed different studios. So the business was growing at a speed that meant that in those early days, having learned how to animate, there were always jobs being offered, so I was very lucky there. And the business grew, because after, several years, the film industry improved, voices were recorded on film, and shortly after that, color came in. each of these added many elements to animation that had not been there in the early silent days. And an animated cartoon like Crazy Cat or Felix the Cat, who were very popular in their time, gradually they were kind of lost in the fast, rapid development that was being made primarily at that time in Hollywood.
So when you made your change from illustration to animation, you didn't feel you were selling out?
No, I didn't feel that at all. I missed it. I had friends who were illustrators. I won't name them because there were several of them. I'd gone to art school with some of them who became very, very well-known illustrators.
You were telling a story, La Cava, that you worked with, was originally an illustrator and then a cartoonist and then a feature film director?
He was not precisely an illustrator. He had a comic strip in the old New York World, and that was, you might have said, was a step toward illustration, but basically it was a comic strip. And he became lured by the first animation, the Button Jeff Studio, and he got in there, and being a rather well-trained artist, he moved along very rapidly. A few years from the time we had left the Chicago Art Institute, he had become director in her studio, and there was only one director. It was a small studio, maybe 5 or 6 animators. And I, in the meantime, had gone west and become what I call a song cover decorator. I made songs before radio came in. It was popular in America to buy a published song, take the copy home, play it on the piano, and sing it at home. And there were millions of people who entertained themselves just by standing around a piano and playing all of the popular music.
Wasn't it a music sheet that Dave Fleischer gave you?
Well,
that was the creation of Betty Boop, or the inspiration?
That had something to do with it, yes, because when Dave came over to my drawing desk, I was working at the Flashers. That was in the early 1930s. And he handed me a sheet of music, and it had a picture of Helen King on the cover, one of the really highly talented and very popular nightclub singers at that time. And so I used her face, more or less, as an introduction to creating the Betty Boop character.
Mm-hmm.
She had spit curls, which were very popular by the young teenagers at that time, and I drew a little oval head and put spit curls hair on it, and the character went on from there and gradually evolved into the Betty Boop character.
Mrs. French has told me, and I've seen you before, Mrs. French tells me you speak with your hands a lot. You're sitting on your hands. Are you nervous?
I know I'm doing it on purpose. I don't. As a matter of fact, I thought of that before I sat down. I have casually studied newscasters that I like to listen to, and I noticed that you rarely see their hands, and I have seen many non-professional talkers who are always talking with their hands.
Oh, that's okay. That's how you
thought this time I'm going to sit on my hands. So
no.
You want to continually see fingers and hands in front of my face.
Well, you've made your living using your hands, so it's appropriate,
well,
I think, perhaps.
I don't know. Hands are expressive. They are. Oh, you can't express things too well with your feet. Some people do it by nodding their head and blinking their eyes and doing 100 other things. I have decided in the short or the mild experience I've had before a camera that hands are very dangerous things. They can intrude into what you're saying. That's basically what I'm trying to do.
Well, you say your hands are expressive, but feet maybe not, but you can make any object expressive. You've made couches sing and lampposts walk and buildings sway.
Well, that is true, particularly in the Flasher studio. I wish I could draw on a few incidences, but the Flasher theory of making pictures, and it is a very comic theory. It is something, let me back up even a century. Human beings 1,000, 2,000 years ago attempted to express themselves in drawings, as the early hieroglyphics of Egypt are part of their alphabet, is pictures of men doing things, pouring a flask of water or kneeling down to feed an animal. It is really part of the speaking voice of early civilization. The Greeks did it. They covered their pottery with beautiful drawings, very beautiful different poses and historic scenes. And the early islanders of the island of Bali cut out heavy metal and cardboard style characters that were really puppets controlled by strings, and they attempted to express themselves. And the early Chinese theater wore masks that were comic characters. It wasn't until film came. The human race has always tried or wished or attempted to make a fool of itself for the sake of its own entertainment. And these different devices didn't go as far as they wanted to go until the motion picture came into being. And with that, the expression of doing foolish things for people to laugh at. The early animation was, mainly by Winsor McCay, was quite serious. There was no great attempt to be funny. But when he released this quaint jargon of expression that he was able to do, it only took about 5 years for all of the other comic guys with a lot of very humorous ideas in their heads to start drawing them and make animated cartoons. I've listed most of them. The Flashers was one of the early ones. They started out with a clown. Then as soon as they'd learned to develop a studio that functioned well, then they began to reach out for creative characters of their own. And I was lucky enough to be working with them about that time, and I created many of them. Most of them were seen once and not, but Betty happened to be a character that allowed expansion. I've been asked 1,000 times about Betty, and so I've been compelled to wonder myself, why was she one of the characters that lived through 50 or 60 years? She did it for the same reason that Mickey Mouse did, or that Felix the Cat did, and later on all of the Warner Brothers characters, and the Tom and Jerry over at MGM, and the Walter Lantz characters, Woody Woodpecker and Walrus and his other characters. So I don't know where this question started.
Why? No, it's why do you suppose the fascination with animals throughout animation?
Well, I've been asked that question, and I believe that we started with animals because they could be expressed with a very simple formula. Human beings it takes years to learn to draw a good human being. Animals, almost any child will try to draw a picture of a cat or a dog, and if they're very skillful, they may draw rabbits or horses, which take a little more skill. And they found that they could do that, and that they animated freely. They had formulas developed that kept them very simple. Mickey Mouse is only a combination of different shapes, circular forms. So his eyes are circles, his head is circles, his ears are a couple of symbols, and hands are a bunch of bananas. There's nothing but circles all over the character, and for that reason, he was easy to animate. And being easy to animate, he became a popular character through the power of interesting story writing and gradually improving animation.
We can get away with a lot more things with animals too, I suppose. Especially the violent gags, the sight gags.
Well, that's true. As I hinted earlier, the first animation was not violent. It became violent because I believe of that native instinct toward violence that human beings, we've always, as far back as history as you can read or learn, people, even the Greek plays, deliberately tried to make fools of people that they lived with. It was an innate desire of the human being, the humanoid, to try to make a fool of himself. The animation gave him a chance to do that. And they did it, some of the early animation, particularly things like Popeye, brutality was flamboyant. It just simply charged the pictures with all kinds of things that human beings could not and would not dare to do with each other, except in professional wrestling occasionally. I don't know, football goes quite a ways toward there. I think there are at least a half dozen American-style, Canadian-style football players are laid up in every game with a half-broken knee or a dislocated elbow or something. Now, there's an instinct in the human being to want to make a fool of himself, to create laughter, and the animation gave them that chance. They had a wonderful implement where they could go as far as they wanted to. And they started with animals who were sort of like toys to children. The child will throw his toys around. The little 2-year-old girl will, if she's learned to talk, will cuddle her girl toy and call it baby and be very affectionate. And the next thing you throw it in the bathtub and let it sink if it will sink. But I'm sure all of us have seen people laugh uproariously at brutal humor because we knew nobody was hurt. And the cartoon characters were created on that basis. They had that construction. They could be hurt and bounce back into their natural form, and nobody shed a tear.
I guess especially during the 40s at Warner's with the Looney Tunes and that, some terribly fast and violent, as you say, people get run over by, or characters get run over by a steamroller and flattened but pop right back up again. That took a lot of animation, I guess, as well.
Well, yeah, Warner's was one of the most guilty, of course, if you call it guilt. But they happened to get an assemblage of story men, gag men, idea men, and animators who toyed with that type of humor, and fellows like Tex Avery who reached down into the depths of the most ridiculous and humorously idiotic themes and successfully brought them to the surface, and everybody laughs at them. Well, everybody that hasn't been an Oxford graduate, at least, taken the masters in English.
I suppose, though, if we look at it if we look at the cartoons, the way they've cut them up and put them on television for 10, 15, 20 minutes at a stretch, it does seem a little violent and a little brutal, but originally they were just designed for a warm-up to a motion picture in a theater.
Yeah, that may be a very important point. I've heard similar attitudes taken toward animation. Yes, it was a warm-up. I remember in the vaudeville houses, which I loved to attend when I was younger and when there was vaudeville. Usually they ran the cartoon while the audience was still coming into the theater. It was kind of a warm-up, and of course I, being devoted to animation, I liked the cartoon as well as almost anything else. But at the same time, I think it served a great relief weapon in the anime or in the live-action theaters, for particularly the more sentimental or the more serious or the sob-jerking type of picture that many of our early pictures were. The cartoon relieved that tension that might have existed. And of course, when they got into making feature-length animation, then they were deliberately thrown in there. If there was a very serious scene, very often it'd be a very ridiculous one to kind of relieve any tension that the serious theme. That particularly is rememberable in the Disney Dumbo picture, for one that comes to my mind immediately. The tragedy between Dumbo and his mother being locked up, put in chains and locked up in a big cage, and poor little Dumbo himself being in terrible trouble, and the mouse kind of tries to cheer him up, to take him over and let him visit with his mother. And not only the advantage at that time of having beautiful music, a beautiful musical lullaby to illustrate the animation, but the sensitive thing of the mother coming down with her trunk and swinging this little baby elephant during this melody, that was a very deep moment in animation.
Would you like a drink?
Whiskey?
Oh.
Is that recorded?
Wish we did. We noticed we took it down.
Thank you.
Are you still comfortable?
I should be in this modern American overtuffed lounging rocker.
How are things there? Okay, we continue on? Yep. We continue on for just a little bit longer. Can you just tilt that up a bit? Or actually, just widen the shot. Okay? Okay, that's fine. We were talking about cartoons as adult entertainment before a warm-up audience, and you mentioned vaudeville. Of course, vaudeville humor has always been violent as well, hasn't it?
Well, there usually were several acts, and it went from a team of sentimental singers to acrobats to Chinese athletes to perhaps a popular one individual in public affairs who, a nearly famous person, but one who had a public audience more or less. And there were, of course, comics like W.C. Fields and the Four Marx Brothers started in vaudeville, and many of the later great comics who got into motion pictures later, they had a 10-minute skit or something like that.
Did you enjoy those yourself personally?
Oh, I was insane about them. It was when you could be entertained at an hour and a quarter, an hour and a half for 10 cents, a man be a fool to stay away.
You mentioned the art of the director of animation is really in timing. Did you get some kind of sense of timing from going to vaudeville and watching?
I imagine that I did. The greatest, I wouldn't call him a comic, the greatest humorous entertainer in those early days. I'm going way back into the 20s, the 1920s, and of course the world is sad enough with Prohibition, but they needed entertainers at those times.
Do you have any favorites WC or
W.C.
Buster
Fields
Keaton?
was one of them. Ed Wynn was one of them. And this great Negro comedian, what is his name? Bert Williams.
Bert Williams?
Yeah, Bert Williams. He had the most immaculate sense of timing of any performer I ever knew. He was not a great singer. He had a voice that would go from deep basso up to almost high tenor. And he would go up and down that as if he were going up a fireman's ladder. He knew how to use that. And he usually used songs that were semi-humorous. I was very lucky to have met him through. I did many songs for W.C. Handy, one time called the grandfather of the blues, and he took me up to Bert Williams' office on Broadway one time. I was going to make a cover for a song that W.C. Handy was printing, and Bert Williams was going to use it in his act. And I always remembered him because all that I wanted to do, and the only reason I wanted to meet him was to tell him how great I thought he was, and to tell him how I followed the vaudeville circuit all the way up Broadway. They had a vaudeville house about every 20 blocks, and just to see Bert Williams when he was on a program, I never got a chance to say a word. As soon as I met Bert Williams, he started saying, "You song cover artists are one of the greatest species of creation that we've ever," and he kept on talking about, I was a nobody. I made a few song covers and got paid a few bucks for them. But he was perhaps the most modest man, and he was the #1, the highest salaried entertainer in the Ziegfeld Follies. And that was a pretty good spot to be in for a colored man in those days.
Sure. You've had a chance during the Betty Boop cartoons when you were animating the Cab Calloway characters. Did you ever meet them?
I only worked on the first 6 of the Bettys, and then the gong from Hollywood drummed in my ears until I finally decided I'd move to this romantic place in the West. And so most of the big orchestra things came into Betty later. They made about 100 of those pictures, and they had to keep searching and reaching for material, and I thought they did a genius stroke in using the big name bands at that time. It gave Betty something wonderful to work with and gave her a great background for her own songs. She was very difficult to animate, so that anything that they could help to fill out a picture and use up time was great from the producer's point of view, but it also now gives the Betty pictures a great formula to subsist on.
When you went to Hollywood, who did you first work with? Was it iWorks?
iWorks, yeah.
And iWorks first, and then iWorks Disney?
Then, after being with iWorks about 3 years, I had heard that Walt was going to do Snow White, and I was lucky enough to change over there. iWorks was branching out, and he more or less urged me to come in as a partner, and I didn't think I was any part of a businessman, and I thought I loved animation, and so Walt was willing to put me on the staff, and so I spent the next 4 or 5 years with Disney.
You have said that iWorks was the genius of animation and Disney the businessman. Did he allow you that opportunity?
I might make it a trilogy and say that Walt and his brother Roy were a business combination that relayed or parlayed a little 2-inch mouth into a $1 billion business corporation, a monolith, a giant business creation that I understand that Disney World, just the land that their park is on down there is bigger than the entire island of Manhattan, and that's pretty good to start with the mouse and end up with something like that.
A lot has been said recently about Walt in a derogatory way, that but his inability to really draw or animate. But you've spoken fondly of him.
Well, Walt, I've often been asked to describe him. He's very hard to describe. I could throw a baseball in any direction, which I wouldn't want to do, and whoever it hit might be exactly like Walt Disney. He was kind of a regular sort of, well, of course, he was in his 20s or just in his early 30s or something, and he was just another human being. He liked to skip out for a coffee break in the middle of the afternoon, and while he always seemed to have his head packed with a million ideas, if the most ordinary person in the studio said, "I had an idea, Walt," he'd stop and listen to him. He was that kind of a person. He played softball with the animators, and it was only about the time that I started working there, he was becoming so busy that he sort of gave up the outdoor sports, although he did have a volleyball court right outside the studio. And however, Roy remained. We had a bowling squad of about 36 bowlers, and Roy, one of the teams Roy was captain of, so he continued to bowl. And I met him in bowling alleys after that. So, and they both played polo, on the horseback polo, which is a pretty rough game in itself.
Well, was Walt, I know Roy has been described as the business mind behind behind the Disney empire, but Walt himself was the fun man or the idea man. But you've talked about his committee in bringing in a storyboard or a bit of animation, and Walt would look at it with his committee. What did you mean by the committee?
Well, of course, if we start with a short, there would be one director, and maybe 3 or 4 storymen who had written the story. And Walt, of course, made, when they were doing shorts, which they were for the first year or 2 that I worked there, they were still doing shorts for the theater, and Walt, and he had probably 5 story departments. Walt would go from one to maybe spend the morning with one group and the afternoon with another group. When Snow White was started, then there were roughly 5 under directors that worked directly under Walt, and each of them would take a part of the picture. For instance, there was the situation where the dwarfs were at the diamond mine, getting busy doing comic things and closing up and starting across the creek on their way home at the closing out. And of course, Dopey tapped one big, about $25,000 diamond with his hammer. It didn't sound right. He threw it into the creek and did little stunts like that. And then the singing Hi-Ho, which Shamus Culhane animated as they marched back home, to eventually discover that Snow White had sneaked into their house and pretty well occupied it in their absence.
Grim, I'm going to have to stop right now because Grim is obviously getting tired.
Yeah.
So we just have to wrap up. And the first thing you do is turn off the lights.
Yeah. Okay, Grim, thank you very much for the talk again. It's always I've got a few questions I want to ask Grim first, just to finish off last night. You okay? Grim,
Yes,
there was one question last night that I wanted to ask. We've talked about the various animators you've worked with, of course Tisse and Shamus. What intrigues me personally, who were some of the gag men that you work with, the story men? I know.
At the Flasher studio, which was one of the earlier studios I worked in, of course, Dave Flasher was technically the head of the story department. A fellow named Bill Turner actually kept the group going. And who were there? I've forgotten names. They had 4 or 5 men who generally worked to build up the stories.
Joe Stultz was one.
Bill Stouch.
Yeah.
Yeah, I remember
Bill
he sold
Stouch.
a bunch of Irish sweepstake tickets one time that were
And some
phonies.
and some bad whiskey. He was a bootlegger on the side.
Of course.
And of course the other one is Teddy Sears, because although he did animation, he also did a lot of gags.
That was Teddy Sears?
Mm.
Ted Sears, yes, he was very shortly after I started for Flashers, he came to Disney's. And Ted became the head of the story groups on the short pictures. I don't know what he did on Snow White. This was before Snow White was animated. And he had Otto Englander, who was a very resourceful story man, and Webb Smith, who had been a former newspaper cartoonist, also a very creative type of mind. And there were, of course, really 3 or 4 story groups going. Dick Friel and a couple of the old-timers from New York came out and worked on a few stories. Like, what was the ghost picture, the Mickey Mouse ghost thing?
Yeah.
Turned out to be a very funny, very good picture. And
Well,
I would have to research. They're going back 50 years. It's a long time to go.
what were some of them like? Were they
Well, they were double
Regular.
martini men, most of them. They ate lunch there was a restaurant down on Vermont Avenue, about a very short walk from the studio, although that we usually drove, but they chose by preference a place that had a bar. There were other nice restaurants in the neighborhood. But they were real nice guys. I mean, there was no kidding. I mean, they knew what it was all about. Ted Sears probably knew every comic story that was ever written. I mean, most stories have a basic format. And as years progress, as you move from horses to telephones to electric lights to phonographs to radio and television, the same jokes keep coming up, but they're written around with a different subject material. But Ted knew all of them. I don't know that I remember one, a Christmas dinner, you certainly were there, out at Flashers, and
Oh, yes.
they hired a few professional performers to entertain this mob of animators.
Yeah.
And they had a story guy there who was picking up an extra buck for that performance. And just 1 second before he gave the gag line to his story at the very end, Ted popped up between drinks and told us what it was.
Stole his thunder.
He got off in that fellow. He dressed up for the occasion. Do you remember that?
Yes, yes. That was at the Wellington Hotel
Of course, Warner's had some real kooky storymen over there. I should, I really don't quite recall their names. But that's, most of them drew fairly well. And, but they were good idea men, and they eventually, even though they started in as animators or animator assistants, they finally ended up in story groups.
Didn't a lot of the early humor, there was a kind of almost a blend from a lot of vaudeville humor, a lot of physical humor in the early story ideas and early gag stuff. A lot of it came from a tradition of vaudeville and visual humor.
Oh, I know it did. Yeah, well, we out in that day when vaudeville was active, we never missed a show, you know. Mm-hmm. And the story men, they were resourceful. They were pretty smart guys. They knew where the humor was, and I imagine that each of them had a library of comic books. In fact, some of the animators did too. But, well, early on, if you get down, even when we were at Flashers, the animators chipped in. If they had a gag or an idea, they just threw it in. There was no heresy, no hard feeling about it. An idea could come from anywhere.
It's interesting to notice that the early Max Sennett stuff, which began in 1914, 15, around there, it in a way died out in live action because you had Buster Keaton, Charlie Chaplin, and a host of other people who stopped that kind of humor and settled into pantomime long before the animators got that idea. They kept on with this until 1933 or 4 when Walt began to notice, I guess, that this pie in the face thing was going out of style some time back. And so that's when he began to wrench us out of that, you know, because Mickey in those early movies, like Steamboat Willie and so forth, were just a vigorous pie in the face character, you know. It was a number of years later until Walt began that. But what's interesting about that time, long gone, Charlie Chaplin and those people had just, you know, wiped out that vigorous early approach, you know, that Max Sennett had. He was out of business then.
We were talking yesterday about that sense of timing.
Oh, yeah.
And getting some of that from stage and film. Tisse, what would you say is the, where do you get that sense of timing? Can it be learned?
It's just a good question, because I learned, when I got to UPA, where I worked with Grimm, first time it was in February 1956. Now, I animated before that, in Paris, or even back earlier than that. But I learned timing from Grimm, because Grimm said that the soul of animation is timing. And we always watched, this is anywhere. I am moving on the street or sitting in the bus or watching people, I am always watching their timing. And this is why I watch all the dancing and anything on TV, just for that. That's a real. I think that's the most essential in animation, is it not?
Yes.
Yes.
That was going to be one of my questions for a little later. Actually, was what do you feel is there such a thing as a single most important ingredient to animation?
Well, if I can pick up the idea, it's been a real hard sell idea with me. I think I was surprised that these two commercials that Tisse brought, the crows and the other things, I'd forgotten I ever worked on them. Tisse told me that we had done them out in New York, and I thought the timing was very good on them. And there are ways. It would take 15 minutes to even basically say what timing is. The first important thing is to read a soundtrack. I have found, much to my amazement, that animators who've been animating for years don't realize that the soundtrack should be analyzed as careful as the machinery of an automobile or something like that. You should know precisely what and why each part is there. Now, when we first animated to sound, when sound came in, either in music, well, take music as one part. You have a musical beat. It's an 8-beat, a 10-beat, some kind of a beat. And in a very primitive way, we learned how to make a thing bounce or an accent hit on the beat. Then we learned that became very monotonous, so we would skip a beat or hit in the middle of the beat or miss it. Or as Art Babbitt used to do, you'd get an important beat in music and you'd expect him to hit it, and Art would wait till the last frame before he hit it. It was tantalizing, and yet it was fascinating. But there's many ways. You have 3/4 time, you have 4/4 time, you have all kinds of times, and your animation becomes terribly monotonous unless you begin to not only analyze it, but read it. I used to write dialogue down on a sheet of animation paper and then play the record and listen to it and accent the, usually it's a vowel in a word, but in a sentence with 10 words, 2 or 3 of them may be stronger than the other 5 or 6. So you analyze that, and then I would make a key, very quick, rough drawing, a key position, a very exaggerated drawing, and I would go on through the whole dialogue or the whole reel that way. Then when I got into animating, I'd have this rough reading of my own. And I personally always used a metronome, which was set to time for a beat. And it was like having an assistant director that I didn't have to pay any attention to there, so that I could make these drawings and get a feeling. If you had a 5 or 10 beat walk, you wanted to get there at the right time. First you discovered what it was you had to, the doorknob, or what it was you had to do when you got there. Then you would use your starting position to get there at the right moment. I suppose there are 1,500 different little things, but basically know the importance of the beat and which is the most important beat. And you can skip many of them. Well, somebody else can
I just have one thing I would like to say. When I received the soundtrack, there's a little spot in the soundtrack. I played the soundtrack maybe for 2 days and clean the house or cook something. And just the soundtrack goes on and on and on. Now, I believe that the soundtrack has the animation buried. And you just have to listen to it long enough and enough time to just get it out and put it on paper. Now, I really honestly believe it. And if I want to say one more important thing in animation, I would say to catch the right weight of every character you work with. Because I think that is one secret of character. Don't you think so?
Mm-hmm.
I think that would be one important thing. To be sure that you have the character, you know exactly that this character is 135 pounds, and you are in business. I think
Right.
so.
Sound is an important part of animation. Who who's responsible for the sound? Do you ever get involved in the sound before a picture?
Sometimes.
In
Sometimes.
Yeah, well, Shamus, as a director, had to. As an animator, of course, even, you go ahead, Shamus, you were...
Oh, well, sometimes even animators get involved. It depends on the studio. Now, in Disney's, none of us got involved as animators. It was very rare. They had a group of people who made sound and sound effects, and they were very rarely the real sound that you would expect. They always made a composition of various types of sounds and put them together, so there was kind of a caricature of the sound itself instead of just a natural sound.
Mm-hmm.
It was from that kind of thinking that they got into such thing as if somebody stopped, they put in a brake screech rather than just the noise of somebody on a gravel path or something.
Did you ever get down into the studios when they're recording special effects? I mean, just to wander around at all?
No.
Yes.
No,
You
I don't know what to
could.
do.
I have gotten into a few of these just casually, but it wasn't a part of our business as animators, really. And most of the studios had the track making pretty well under control. They knew pretty well what they were doing.
Back to we talked yesterday about your history and your start, and you told us about illustration and that. One of the things I wanted to ask was, when you got started, did you have any idea how long it would last, how long animation was going to be around, or was it just a fad that wouldn't continue like movies originally, then sound, the talkies weren't going to last?
I never gave it any thought. However, in some of the early days, sometimes the job only lasted 3 months or maybe a year, so you got used to that pretty quickly. And then finally, when the cartoon, actually the history, not the total history, the introduction to animation was the silent animation. The history began when sound came in. Then when color came in, it immediately became worldwide entertainment. It became very important. Even the little shorts shorts that were made 50 years ago are being shown over and over again today on television.
Was there a golden age of animation, a golden age of cartoons?
Oh, very definitely. It was at Walt's from 1935 till about 1942, and then there was a overlapping thing there, several years of work over at UPA, right?
Yeah, well, I would say they did kid according to the time the theater stopped using pictures. Immediately the budget changed so that you could not afford to make. There was never any holding down at all, as long as the theater guaranteed. Paramount, for instance, owned 2,500 theaters. The cartoon was paid for before it was ever started. But you didn't have that when you began to do little commercials for televisions, and could not afford the theater just stopped running cartoons because they could not compete with free cartoons that were being shown on TV. And that changed the whole history of the thing.
Here's a case now, though, where we have someone producing shorts, half-hour shorts, primarily for television.
Well, that's, I think, an outgrowth of the fact that people still want to see animation, and as Grimm says, theaters can't, because of the structure of distribution now, theaters can't afford to show short work, and that television as a medium has such a voracious appetite for material that the TV half hour has come to be what 5-minute shorts were back in the 30s and the 40s, that they can be produced, especially, the more limited ones can be produced fairly reasonably. And that's where it's, the form as entertainment in the dramatic sense, I think, is being perpetuated, although there's some really excellent and imaginative work being still done in commercials per se, because commercials to sell products, as I'm sure everybody here can attest to, that usually commercial budgets are fairly substantial, and you can do a nice piece of inventive work, or you can take a little bit extra time and make the thing really work nice.
What are some of the techniques now used today, such as xerography, using Xerox for tracing, that have been able to cut down some of the costs and allow you to produce the kind of quality things that you're producing?
Well, Xerox is one very strong element. I think the gradual mechanization of the camera itself, from starting with the actual motorization of a lot of the functions of a camera. I mean, back for most of these gentlemen's history in the business, the camera was entirely operated manually, so that every time you wanted to do even the slightest little bit of camera move on a scene, the cameraman had to do all of the calculations for all the little cogs and then turn all those little cogs every frame he shot. Now they have motors that run it, and they have also in recent years introduced computers that can do all the mathematics and feed that information into the motor, so that all the cameraman has to do is change the cell. And that kind of stuff has really helped cut costs. But who knows where it's going to go from here. I think there's going to be a quantum leap in technology because nobody's been able to figure out a way to put into a computer program what we've been talking about, and that is the essence of timing and the essence of movement. And the idiom, and the thing that if I may, the thing that is crucial is the idiosyncrasy of the animator saying, well, gee, it'd be really good to have the hand stretch a little bit in this drawing, right? I remember a scene in Pinocchio where Jiminy Cricket is dancing on the violin strings, and he does a little thing where he slides down the strings and then he does a little march back up the strings with his umbrella. And I studied that at one point, and going through it frame by frame, there is one drawing, literally, and I think it was on ones. There was one drawing when he's right down at the end of the thing and he's doing a little turn and his hand sort of goes out in a little flourish. And for one drawing, his fingers are about 3 times longer than they should be. And it just gave that flourish and a little snap, because the next drawing his fingers were the normal length. And just that one little thing gave it the movement back up, just a little bit of a snap. And that's the kind of stuff that, every...
With animation, Art Babbitt says it very well, that animation didn't even start yet. And the limit of animation is the limit of the artist who is doing it. And it could go on and on forever. And it has really no limits. So those golden ages that you mentioned are really 2 golden ages, but in a history of an art. Just like there was the Middle Ages, and there was the Renaissance, and there was the Baroque, and art goes on.
But what do you think about the idea of, the essence, to me, of as a form, is, in the real bottom is the charm of a drawing moving, a drawing brought to life. I mean, I think that's really, it's what it started it all, and to me it's still what people most enjoy. And I just wonder whether animation will get so sophisticated, and so, I mean, especially with computer,
Yes.
I mean, you think about Tron and stuff like
so
that.
much interested in. from
What about that idea that, you know,
Well, I think Walt, I think Walt, in a way, went the same way as his Hudson River Valley School of Painting did after the Civil War, when a painter made a painting of a letter torn at the edges with a thumbprint on it, nailed to a painted wall so perfectly that you wanted to pull it off there to read it. Now, where did that go? It ended up in a blind alley where there was no more realism to squeeze out of it. Walt went dangerously into that area. UPA pulled us out again because there's something nice about saying, hey, here's a funny drawing. It's not live, it's not round, it doesn't exist in space, but we're having some fun. You pull the whole thing back out of that blind alley, because, see, I think when you get into seriously using rotoscope, you're into that kind of pursuit of realism to the end of, nothing. I know Grimm used to ignore the rotoscope. He told me one time on the last scene he did on Snow White, he took drawing 1 and drawing 100 and traced them off, and then he did the rest himself in the middle, ignoring the other 98 drawings. Isn't that true, Grimm?
That's true, but I don't think I was the first one to do that. Rotoscope can spoil. If you try to take it too literally, it can kill your animation. And occasionally you see rotoscope animation on the screen, and you know that it was traced off of drawings. So you've got to know what you can use. Yeah, very often we'd get scenes where Snow White was just sitting there singing, and doing nothing. You had to do something with it. And there was no use of using those drawings because you'd ended up with nothing. It'd be like a man working for a computer or something like that, just reversing the whole virtue of the mechanical process.
I don't know. I feel that animation should be fundamentally different from live action. So I dislike rotoscope. Such. You watch people, how they move or what they do, and then you create a totally new live person that never existed. And I really don't know.
well, it's I don't know who said it. Maybe one of you could give this little axiom a credit, but there's the thing of making it move how it feels rather than how it looks. In other words, the movement should be how the movement feels rather than how it looks.
I think Walt said that.
Now, that is, I believe one important thing in animation is, you just said the drawing that moves. Now, I don't put it that way. I think is you sit down and you create a non-existing somebody who comes out of you, okay, to express some real human emotions or feelings in such way that could never be done with a live action camera. I think this is what animation really should be, or is, at least for me it is. That I always...
But what we were getting into is this rotoscoping.
Yes.
And how lifelike it really is. I have an ashtray here.
Oh, thank you.
There are times when animation looks like it is so real that it could be live. We saw Gene Kelly dancing with the mouse,
Yes.
and if it looked like Snow White or Prince Charming had been rotoscoped.
I am sure Prince Charming was.
Yeah.
Some of the I felt some of the magic was
Yeah.
lost just a little bit. It is very lifelike. You don't depend on the rotoscope as much then.
Well, when you learn how to animate, you can animate anything. Rotoscope, I think, should be used only for complicated things that you have not been able to study all your life, like a dance or skating or something like that. And I don't think there's anything wrong in using it, but you should have the character get far enough away from it so that it no longer feels like rotoscope.
It's a springboard, right?
Enhance.
It's a springboard to do your animation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's still true today?
Still true today. Earlier in '81, I did a musical sequence in the feature that we've just finished, and they did quite a bit of filming of the musical sequence, the song, the delivery of the song, and I found that the actor just couldn't move lively enough. You know, I mean, there were things that I wanted the character to do. You know, that I was in exactly the same boat as Grimm. I had to take the first drawing and throw the rest of them away because it just didn't go far enough, and it didn't, you know, like he's leaping around. He's a very active, this character I was doing was a very active performer, and I found that I had to, you know, when I wanted him to jump around, the actor just couldn't jump high enough, so I took the first drawing and I made him jump higher, you know. You can still use it, but as Grimm says, you can't let it tie you down.
I think there's a good reason for it. An actor is working in one medium, and we are working in another one altogether, where we don't have gravity, and age doesn't mean anything. So we are actors, and we don't need some other actor to tell us how to act. Unless it's, as Grimm says, some intricate tap dance or something like that, which we don't
But
know.
Grimm, you should remember, all those years we worked together, there was a lot of dance. Now, Grimm just faked everything. There was not a single photograph or film of dancing people. Don't you remember? You were just
Yes,
faking
yeah.
everything, and it was much better than any live-action dance.
Is that like the tango in the Popeye cartoon?
I'm not talking about, I am talking about the time we worked
Tisse and
together.
I worked on commercials in New York, and of course they were full, totally full animated commercials, as the few little ones that you saw here. Those were sufficiently animated to fit into a Disney feature. They were about as fully animated as the blackbirds or the crows in Dumbo. But in fact, they were carried further much
Yes,
of the
but in
time.
every dance, you just said, no, I don't know how this dance is done, so I will just fake it.
Well, that
And so you
comes-
did.
Yeah, that comes
And
right back to hitting that beat. If you hit the important beats and emphasize them and hold them the proper number of frames, you can fake anything, but you can save a lot of time if you have a dance thing by just maybe even picking out the key positions. Because we're not supposed to be trained. It takes a ballet dancer 15 years to learn how to dance, and you can't expect an animator to pick it up. Now, Art Babbitt did a very wonderful thing with the mushroom dance, but he was married to a professional dancer. He was insane about ballet dancing, and he is quite a student of music. And that little mushroom dance is a little gem because it has the unexpected. I don't think he posed dancers for that. I think Art probably created every step himself. But
I am sure, because you remember in Raggedy Ann, the camel is dancing. There was nothing shot for
that's
that.
right.
He just did everything.
One question I had yesterday in the theater, and that was you must have a tremendous sense of more than just pride. I don't know what the correct word is, but having worked,
Conceited, put it that way.
but having worked on something and going through even pencil tests and sketches and the pencil test, but finally seeing it on screen and looking at it, and it moves and it works, you know, that there is that feeling
Well, I'm sure that there is. You don't have time to go around with your chest very far out because you got a lot of other artists around you are doing something better than you can do. It keeps you pretty modest.
And a lot of the time you're so grateful that it just works.
But
tried.
one little example, and this was a dance thing. I had in one of the Disney caricature things, I had to make Charles Lawton do a hot-shot dance. I didn't know anything about the dance. Dick Lundy was a dancer. I mean, he went to dances, he knew how to dance, he knew the steps. So I didn't know how to do it, and I went to Dick, and he sort of made matchstick movement for me. He showed me how he would have done it. Now, drawing Lawton was difficult enough, but with those little helpings that I got from Dick Lundy, it turned out in a great little scene. And of course, there was I don't think it could have been done at all by rotoscope, because Lawton was hard enough to draw, and we went far on it, and I don't know if you remember that.
Yeah, I remember
picture.
very well. Yes.
It was a tough scene, but it worked out great, and it went as rapidly as any ordinary animation would do.
Well, with all the animation that you've done, did there come a point where you lost that sense of wonder that you pulled it off, or did you pull it
No,
off?
I think it increases. The more you know, the more you dare try. You want to go a little further and see if it works.
Yeah.
Every time I finish a picture and I see it, first of all, I have a feeling that's a person that I have nothing to do with, and I'm always amazed. And when I see a film, it happened with one of the Hobley films. I saw it 5 years later, and I had a very warm feeling that there's a person I used to know very intimately. And of course, because I animated it. And it's like a person that lives on its own, and you somehow, somewhere have something to do with it. Oh, it's an amazing feeling. And more you do it, more amazed you are. At least I am. And it's a great feeling. It's really a creative feeling.
I think one of the things that none of us will ever get over is that anxiety when you stand in front of a moviola and look at a pencil test and you haven't seen it before. You never feel it's going to be good. Never. Am I right? Never. You're always scared.
You're talking about getting personally involved in a character, like you know a character. Is that how do you still feel that propriety to Betty Boop?
Yeah, I have a kind of an affection for her, but it's been built up through the years because I imagine at least 1,000 people who told me they loved her. And I've been to several different theater showings, and they all say the same things. The younger people are picking up on her too, but the first 2 or 3 generations that saw her, they just kind of adopted her. There are people, it's probably saying too much. There's one lady in Washington, D.C. who, she telephones me just to talk about Betty at least once a month. And she's always sending me things that she's bought. She buys 2 of them and sends me one. Just last week, she sent me a couple of Betty rubber stamps. It was on my birthday, actually. It was a birthday present. I don't know how she ever remembered my birthday. I wasn't aware I'd ever mentioned it to her.
A lot has been written about the sexual symbolism in cartoons, and particularly in Betty, I guess. How would you describe that, or explain that?
Well, I never, when I worked on it, even while I was there was no intent to try to make her sexy. She had all of the elements of a girl, and even some of this animation we've seen of Betty, even if she doesn't do very much, if just little steps, if they're cute, they are sexy. I think it's only because she really has the figure of a girl, and the face is, well, it's feminine. I don't know how else to describe it. In spite of the fact that it's calmed up, she has big eyes and these curly hairs, everything. There was no attempt to make a sex symbol. She belonged to the flapper age. That's the way girls dressed at that time. And, the garter helped, perhaps.
Shamus, we talked about that yesterday, and there was something funny you said about that, about the sexual symbolism.
Oh, you mean, shall I say?
Well, sure.
Well, most of the animators in the studio had a fairly cavalier attitude about women. Many of them never associated with normal women. They bought some, but had no interest in becoming engaged or something. They were having a wild time instead. And that goes for the people in the story department. So their idea of sexuality was simply some big ape chasing Betty. That's about all they could imagine. I mean, a light flirtation was beyond them because they never had any, you know. So that it didn't allow for a growth of a cute sexuality unless the animator put it in, but it wasn't in the story. Isn't that so, Ben?
I suppose it's so. I was older than these guys.
It's getting quite late, and I just want to perhaps wrap up this part of the discussion by just one question to Grimm. What do you feel is your greatest contribution to animation?
Well, of course, from my own point of view, Betty is the greatest contribution because I think at least 60 million people in America like Betty. But the most difficult thing I animated, of course, was Snow White, because you couldn't take any liberty. You had to try to make her interesting, but you couldn't open her eyes too wide. You couldn't distort her physical form. You had to keep her quite straight and yet try to make her move enough so that she was still animated. The skirt helped. There are many little things. We learned everything that we could do. But with the dwarfs, you could tie the eyes to the bulbous nose. You could stretch them out or bring them back, and it all worked. You could not do that with Snow White.
So I guess restraint was the most difficult part of it, having to hold that.
Well, we went as far as we dared, and very often she was quite active, but we were within the limitations. But it was a lot of fun drawing her.
Thank you very much for your time, all of you. I know it's been very, very late. I've got a few more questions for all of you, but I thought if we could take the chance now, we could break down the lights, and if you decide you'd like to stay for a little bit longer, you can. And
it's up to Graham, I think.
Oh, you do the talking.
No, I mean, depending how tired you are.
Well,
if you're too tired,
I'm able to stand on my feet with two people helping me.
well, why don't we shut down now and just take a breather and I know see how Mrs. French feels and your wife. Are you going back to? Yeah.
I have to get up very early. I am catching a very early plane, but I'm sure that this corner could be left out from the picture, and nobody will see that I am missing.
You can write it in a letter, and they can type it.
I think
Okay, thanks a lot.